Hello, everybody. This is Professor Mitchell for Ivy Honors Psych 205 Abnormal Psychology. This is the week of October 23rd, and so I just wanted to give a brief update to let everybody know where we are when it comes to assessments and exams and things of that nature. The midterm, because of the scheduling kind of changes that we've had throughout the last couple of weeks, the midterm is going to be the last full week of October, the first full week of November. So I believe the day that we will be meeting for class is October 30th, which is the Tuesday, and it will open up on that Tuesday and it will be open all the way through the next Monday. So you'll have a full week to do it. And the topics covered will be chapters 1 through 4, so kind of the foundational things of abnormal psychology, chapter 19, which goes into forensic psychology and insanity, and then the chapter on anxiety, the chapter on schizophrenia, and the chapter that we're going to cover today. So those will all be fair game when it comes to the midterm, but remember, it's on Ivy Learn, it's on Canvas, so while you do need to be prepared, if you haven't reviewed, it's going to be kind of cumbersome to get all the way through the midterm exam. But just ensure that you kind of review before you open up the test. The test is going to be primarily, if not all, multiple choice. That way you get your grade back a little bit quicker than if I have to go in and do some grading of the short answers. And also, I find that those are a little bit more indicative of the kind of learning that the distributed education that we're doing right here, it's a little bit easier for you guys. So just be mindful of that. So I'm going to go ahead and begin the lecture now. And I will obviously do a little bit of review next week. Next week I will be coming to you live, so we will be having our traditional class. Again, I'm mindful of the fact that I think these recorded ones are working out better for most of you, as I've heard, because it not only gives you the opportunity to kind of pause and maybe rewind a little bit, but also I know we have almost half of our very tiny class that really can't be with us for the full time because of scheduling snafus. So I will continue to post up recordings because I think that's great if you want to go back and rewatch or get a review. But next week we will be meeting because I do want to do a bit of a review and get ourselves back together and talk about what the last 6 or 7 weeks are going to be. Okay? So without further ado, let's get into the lecture.
The first rule of Fight Club is, you do not talk about Fight Club. The second rule of Fight Club is, you do not talk about Fight Club.
An easy way to remember about the somatic disorders is to simply realize that the term soma is New Latin or Old Greek for the word body. So somatic disorders are disorders in which an individual has bodily complaints, but the issue stems from the mind. The first somatic disorder we will discuss is factitious disorder. This disorder was commonly known as Munchausen's and Munchausen's by proxy syndrome, and is commonly still referred to that today. A factitious disorder is a disorder which an individual feigns or induces physical symptoms, typically for the purpose of assuming the role of a sick person. Munchausen's by proxy, on the other hand, is when a proxy is used or another person is used to get the same attention. Usually the proxy is a child or an elderly person who is under the care of the individual. An interesting thing to consider when looking at factitious disorder is to realize that the individual is not reinforced by the behavior. They are not receiving any external rewards. Therefore, the action of the factitious disorder is reinforced by itself. For example, if you fake a disease because you don't want to take your final exam, that would not be a factitious disorder because you are getting an external reward by faking the disease. The next disorder we'll discuss is conversion disorder. This disorder is when a medically unexplained bodily symptom occurs. The example from your textbook is one of the key examples that we will use when describing conversion disorder. Glove anesthesia is an excellent example of conversion disorder. In this conversion symptom, the entire hand, extending from the fingertips to the wrist, becomes numb. This is not neurologically possible. Therefore, it must be a condition of the mind rather than a condition of the nervous system. For more information, look at Figure 7-1 in Comer's textbook. Somatic symptom disorder is a disorder in which a person becomes extensively or extremely distressed, concerned, and anxious about bodily symptoms that they are experiencing. This may sound incredibly similar to a term that you have used in your own vocabulary, hypochondriac or hypochondriasis, because these two things are essentially very similar. One of the most interesting things about the somatic and dissociative disorders is that it is one of the few times in the field of abnormal psychology and psychiatry where we really look at the impact and influence of Freud. Because of the psychodynamic view that Freud put forth and the unexplainable symptoms of neurotic disorders, Freud's explanations for some of these issues become predominantly the most powerful explanations we have. When we look at somatic disorders, the behavioral view does not really make a lot of sense. While there are some issues that are behaviorally reinforced and the behavior exacerbates itself, some of these behaviors and some of these symptoms do not get reinforced in the traditional manner. Looking at disorders in which a person continues to seek out doctors who can provide them with some form of relief, the actual disorder is one in which the person seeks out the desire to keep on seeing doctors, and they get their reinforcement from that. One of the major changes between DSM-4-TR and DSM-5 is that the diagnosis of body dysmorphic disorder has been moved from the somatic symptoms disorder to the anxiety disorders. It really could fit into either one of these categories, because body dysmorphic disorder, which is also known as dysmorphophobia, is a deeply held concern or disconcern about an imagined physiological defect of the body in which the person becomes completely involved with understanding and knowing that they have this defect, even though they may not actually have any defect at all. Most often, these are small issues that a person blows out of proportion in their mind. So it does fit in the realm of the somatoform disorders, but it also falls in the realm of the anxiety disorders because it's causing anxiety for the individual. Let's now move away from the somatoform-based disorders and get into the dissociative disorders. Dissociative disorders are issues where the individual has... Next, we will talk about the dissociative disorders. Remember, previously we discussed the fact that these two groups of disorders, the somatoform and the dissociative disorders, were very much based in the Freudian concept of neurosis. Dissociative disorders really focus on neurotic issues, meaning that there are physiological symptoms and physiological issues that cannot be explained by the basis of looking at the physiological being. Let's travel back to Psych 101, and in there you should have learned about René Descartes and his idea of dualism, that the mind and the body are inextricably linked but two separate entities. So many times, when there's an ailment of the body, it is something that manifests in the body and it actually impacts the body. Most of the psychiatric issues that we talk about are made up of the mind, and while there's a component that may be impacting the mind from the body, such as a chemical imbalance in depression or schizophrenia, we normally can delineate the difference between the two. Where these neurotic disorders become incredibly interesting is that in dissociative disorders, the mind is actually attacking its own mind. And when this happens, there are memory and identity issues that really don't have a physiological cause that we know of and we can point to yet. So when we start to dissociate, we start to have memory issues and identity issues that we can't point to and say, this is dementia, or this is Alzheimer's, or this is schizophrenia. It's really the mind acting on its own and creating some form of distortion. The dissociative disorder that you're probably most aware of is one that is called dissociative identity disorder. And even though you may not have heard the term, you've definitely heard of this disorder before. You've probably heard it as what it used to be called in DSM-3 and before, and that is multiple personality disorder. Now that you know that DID and multiple personality disorders are one and the same, these should make a little bit more sense to you as you read the textbook and listen to the lecture. However, I always warn my students that if dissociative disorders make way too much sense the first time you read the chapter or listen to the lecture, you need to go back and reread it, because this is a topic that should be incredibly confusing if you minimally understand it. To be perfectly honest, the more you understand the dissociative disorders, the less you're going to understand, because you dig a rabbit hole in which the more you know, the more you realize you don't understand. So if you read the chapter and you immediately think that this makes perfect sense, go back and read it again. Dissociative identity disorder is a disorder in which a person has two or more distinct personalities. And again, we have to go back to Psych 101 and remember the difference between a personality and a persona. Your persona is the way that you present to other people, and your personality is the underlying characteristics or traits that make you you. My assumption is that anybody who's taking this course probably has multiple personas. You have the persona that is a student, you have a persona that is a member of a family, you have a persona who's a working person who has a job or a career, and you probably have a persona when you're out with your friends on the weekend. My hope for you is that your persona is drastically different when you're with your friends on the weekend than if you're sitting in class listening to a lecture. Either your lecture is far too interesting or your weekends are far too boring if these two things are the same. So the dissociative identity disorder is where you actually have two different personalities going on within one body. Instead of dualism, one mind, one body, inextricably linked, one body, multiple minds, multiple spirits, multiple whatever you want to call it, within that one body. One of the more interesting questions that students often have about dissociative identity disorder is whether or not the personalities interact with each other and understand what's going on. And there is no solid answer or one answer for this. Many people who report to have DID will report that they actually do interact with their alters, or the multiple personalities that are not out and in front and in charge of the body at any given time, while others will report that they do not interact and they don't know what has happened when one alter has been out. To be certain, this would be quite a disturbing situation. Take into account the fact that with multiple personalities, there may also be multiple people that are trying to take over the body. And so if you are one mouthpiece trying to talk to an individual, but there are multiple people who are trying to get a message out, it can be quite confusing. I don't think it's confusing. I think
right,
it's
that is
perfectly
incredibly
rational.
confusing.
I really want some
never
tacos
want that
right
to
now.
happen.
Get your
Can
mind
anybody
back
here
on
go
the
for
lecture.
some
We need to
tacos?
keep talking about the lecture. Okay?
The other dissociative issue we will talk about is dissociative amnesia. This is similar but different than dissociative identity disorder. It's similar in the respect that it impacts the memory of the individual. The difference is that it doesn't involve multiple personalities, it involves one central personality. Dissociative amnesia is when an individual forgets their own biographical information. So they will remember most anecdotal pieces of information, but they'll forget who or where they are. In DSM-4-TR, there was a third dissociative disorder called dissociative fugue. This has now been taken into the diagnosis of dissociative amnesia, and simply it adds in a fugue state in which a person will leave and wander off. If you have trouble remembering this, just remember fugitive. A person who's a fugitive is leaving their normal place and running away. If you remember the lecture from Section 4, there was a short clip from the television show Breaking Bad in which the main character, Walt, is being interviewed by a psychiatrist after going into a dissociative fugue state. In this instance, Walt faked his dissociative fugue state. And this is actually a very common misconception with dissociative fugue, that many people think that this is just an awesome way of getting away with something that you don't want to get caught doing. However, it's very difficult to feign a dissociative fugue state. While the polygraph or the lie detector machine is not great at picking up on all deception, the polygraph machine is very good at picking up instances of faking of dissociative fugue, because people who are feigning not being able to remember their own biographical information will still have physiological responses when presented with information or people that they should know that they may be faking that they do not know.
It's been more than a decade since Herschel Walker was a regular fixture of the sports pages. His brilliant athletic career ended quietly and is now filed away with the legends of sport. But Herschel Walker, at age 46, is back in the public eye and about to make headlines once again.
God don't really care about me scoring touchdowns. God don't care about football. I want to help people.
The revelation is this. For all his life, Walker says he has suffered from dissociative identity disorder, or DID, a rare and controversial mental illness once called multiple personality disorder.
I had it the whole time. I just didn't know what it was. I just know how to cope with it.
There goes Herschel! There goes Herschel!
That young man you saw racing down the sidelines for the Georgia Bulldogs in the early 1980s,
He's running over people!
or flattening would-be tacklers on the road to a national championship, the one who set world records in track and field,
Herschel Walker!
the one who won the Heisman Trophy. Walker says that wasn't him.
He's got a blocker!
The guy who played 15 seasons of pro football and once danced with the Fort Worth Ballet. The one with the obsession for speed, the businessman, the public figure, the husband. None of those guys are him either. Not really. Those are his alters, he says, alternate personalities.
It's just personalities that can do different things for you. I told somebody once, you don't want the Herschel that play football. You don't want the Herschel that do business babysitting your child. You want a different person. When I'm competing, I'm a totally different person.
Earlier this year, when word leaked that Walker was writing a book about his illness, the news was met with a collective and curious shrug. A former teammate, Kevin Butler, said, "I never saw him do anything I thought bordered on being weird or strange." Even his own father, Willis, expressed surprise. "I know him better than anybody because I raised him," he told an Atlanta paper, "and I don't know nothing about that disorder business." And Vince Dooley, Walker's coach at the University of Georgia, said, "That's news to me. All I know is whatever personality he had when he had the football is the one I liked."
Well, he probably did, so that means that he didn't care about the one that may have been suffering or hurting.
Are you shocked that really no one you really knew thought you had something like this, DID?
No, because why would they know that?
Your own father.
Right,
You never really noticed this at all.
right. When would they ever see it? You got to remember this, it's a coping mechanism.
All of which has left Walker in the rather awkward position of having to convince skeptical friends, family, and the public that he really is mentally ill. Even he didn't buy it at first.
I mean, like today, sometimes I may tell myself, Herschel, that's a bunch of crap. That's not real. But then I said that maybe an alter just trying to fool me. I said, Herschel, that ain't right.
Are you serious? You
I
think
know,
it's an
I'm
alter?
being very serious because that's what happens with a person that's like that. But I'm saying that it does exist.
Well, we're all different every day. Sometimes we have different ways, different
Yes,
ways
but
we
it's to
act.
how severe you are.
Walker, who now owns a food service company called Famous 34, would seem to have little to gain and a lot to lose from making such startling claims.
I heard somebody say, Herschel, you wrote a book because you needed money. I'm like, oh, geez, I don't make myself look like a crazy person because I need money. Oh, wow. I'm like, yeah, are you real?
The job of DID is to hide the disorder. That's its job.
Jerry Godsey is Walker's therapist.
So I don't expect mom and dad and brothers and high school coach and friends, I don't expect them to know it.
While the disorder usually surfaces in adulthood, it is thought to develop from childhood trauma.
I was a fat little kid with a speech impediment, and I didn't love myself.
Among the hundreds of disorders defined by the American Psychiatric Association, DID is among the most contentious. Walker's diagnosis is sure to stir the pot.
I think one of the problems we have in our society is that Hollywood brought us our definition of DID. And everybody thinks that DID should look like that.
In 1976, Sally Field introduced America to Sybil Dorsett, a traumatized young woman fractured into more than a dozen personalities Little girls, boys, a grandmother.
You're gonna hook me. You're gonna hook me.
The movie won 4 Emmys, but was widely panned by mental health experts as over-the-top and misleading, and misconceptions about the disorder linger to this day.
And that's one of Herschel's missions, is that I want to make sure people know that you don't have to be a SIBO to be DID. These alters are not just developed to carry trauma. They're also developed to help person adapt to life and function.
And for most of Walker's life, he says, that's just what they did. The warrior alter handled football and the pain that comes with it. The hero took over in public. The sentry kept friends and family at a distance.
It's not something people do consciously. Once he switched to that part of him, there's a thing we call amnesia that separates that part of the brain from the other part of the brain.
Godsey says he met one of Walker's alters who actually appeared to be of a different race.
If I remember noticing that he put his fingers in his hair exactly the way a white person would.
What do you mean? So,
Yeah.
normally you would never do this, and
No,
I would?
I'll never do that.
Do you think DID pushed you into being more successful?
I don't know, but that's the reason I glorify DID if it did, because that's something good. One thing I say is that's good and bad. I'm not just saying everything is great at DID.
So what's really negative about having DID?
Oh, well, there's a lot of things negative.
In the beginning, it was just very strange behavior.
Cindy Grossman was Walker's college sweetheart. They married in 1983. And for 16 years, she says, she saw no signs of mental illness.
He had the ability to hide that because I think all the alters inside were focused on football.
But when his career ended and the competition was gone, Cindy says Walker's subconscious coping system went haywire.
I began to see the alters.
You saw alters?
I saw alters. I saw voice changes.
Is there any way you can tell me the difference in his voice from one alter to another?
Raspy. He would say things like he didn't know who I was.
His own wife?
Right.
He didn't recognize
He would
you?
refer to me as Miss Lady.
Did he forget what your name was?
I don't think he knew.
Really?
It's hard to explain. Even his physical countenance would change. First thing I thought was he had the devil in him or something.
So first, Cindy turned to the church for help.
She came to me to find out how to cope with it.
She's the one that first told you about this DID?
Yes, she did.
Have you seen it with him?
I've seen it a few times, yeah.
Another pastor even suggested an exorcism.
I wasn't pushing the church for exorcism. I was just trying to find an answer.
How many different alters do you think he had? Or has?
I think he has a lot. I don't know. I can't determine. But I met quite a few of them.
Any of them dangerous?
Yes.
His football career now behind him, Hershel Walker says his alternate personalities began to assert control. It was around this time Walker developed a fascination with guns and death. At one point, with a loaded pistol in his car, he admits he set out to kill a man over a trivial business dispute.
In your book, you write, the visceral enjoyment I'd get from seeing the small entry wound and spray of brain tissue and blood, like a 4th of July firework.
Right.
You got into a position where you were really about to commit murder.
Well, I don't know whether you're going to commit murder, but the thing is, I'm not going to shy away from violence.
But did you want to kill that guy?
Oh, yeah, I did want to kill him. Yeah, I did.
He tells the story that he was on the edge of wanting to kill someone.
Oh, yeah. I was probably one of them.
Do you think he wanted to kill you?
He said he did.
He said that to you?
Put the gun to my temple.
He had the gun right to your head? What did he say?
I'm going to blow your effing brains out. I just must have had the strength of God in me because I just looked him in the eye and I said, go ahead, pull the trigger. I know where I'm going. Do you know where you're going?
I mean, is this a fight amongst husband and wife?
No.
And do you think that was a completely different person?
Mm-hmm.
Different voice?
Yeah. I mean, there was somebody there that was evil.
Walker doesn't deny he threatened his wife, but claims to have no memory of it.
Do you not remember something like that because you think that was another alter, or do you want to get out of having to talk about it?
No. If I can, I'm talking about everything else. If I can remember, I'd talk about it.
He says he doesn't remember a lot of the details of these.
He may not, but I certainly do.
A lot of the things that happened there that she may remember, he doesn't remember, because those were the things that were being done by these alters, which was so unlike him.
During one session with Walker and his wife, Godsey says a rageful alter emerged and threatened to kill everyone in the room.
The eyes changed. Those eyes that came out there didn't care anything about me, and when he says, I'm going to kill you, I believed it.
He said to you, he wants to kill you?
Yeah. That's not Herschel, though. That's what I'm trying to tell you. That was this raging one who could do that.
Eventually, Walker took out his anger by punching a hole in the door, and another alter emerged, this one a young boy.
Who was in terrible pain because the hand was broken.
I don't remember that one, but
You don't remember that at all?
No, I don't remember that, but I probably did it.
They said you broke your hand.
Yeah, I probably broke my hand a lot.
Is part of this to kind of blame that kind of activity, that kind of feelings?
No, you got to take responsibility for it.
Walker later called his wife for a ride home from the hospital.
And he said, Herschel's hungry. Do you know what he likes to eat? I need to get him something to eat. I said, well, I know he likes wings.
So he didn't know what kind of food he ate, who he was, changed his name.
No, he was a different person.
Do you think there's any possibility that he just wants to use this to explain away some of these things that he went through and what he did?
No.
There are a lot of doctors that look at this and say, we don't think this really exists, this DID.
That makes me kind of angry. I just know he has it. I know what I saw.
Your ex-husband is a very famous American athlete. Why did you take so long to publicly tell about what you went through with him?
Because I protected him. I think I did what the Lord wanted me to do. And I have no regrets. It would be different if there wasn't a reason for the behavior. But when there's a reason, then you have to have compassion.
For that, Hershel Walker is thankful.
No matter what sinning I went through, Cindy stayed there and fought with me and did everything she could with me.
Do you think he's better off now than he was those years ago?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think that was a very bad period of time.
Do you think this will ever happen again with him?
I pray that it doesn't. I think the more he seeks help and gets help, the better he'll be.
Walker has been in therapy for 8 years now, but takes no medication. He feels he's got the unruly classroom in his head more under control now.
I've totally changed from back then to where I'm at today.
He knows that by revealing his illness publicly, he's setting himself up for the doubters, even ridicule, but he says he doesn't care.
A lot of people may have these problems, but they are too ashamed or they're too scared to come out and say something. I said, I'm not ashamed because, guys, I'm human. I'm not nobody special. I'm just Herschel.
Walker says he'd trade all his athletic accomplishments to help just one person with this disorder. He'd even give up that Heisman Trophy, which he says he doesn't remember receiving. Bob Woodruff, ABC News.
Perhaps the most stigmatized and misunderstood psychological disorder of them all, even among psychologists. Maybe because it's pretty rare, affecting about 1% of the population, schizophrenia causes more anxiety in the media, in the public, and even in doctors' offices than any other mental illness. As a result, its sufferers have often been shunned, abused, or locked up. And among the many fallacies that surround the disorder is simply what it means. The word schizophrenia literally means split mind, but contrary to popular belief, the condition has nothing to do with a split in personality or multiple personalities. The term refers instead to what's sometimes called a split from reality. Multiple personality disorder, now known as dissociative identity disorder, is a totally different type of condition, a kind of dissociative disorder. And these two are shrouded in misconceptions, partly because they were the subject of probably the greatest psychological hoax of all time. While many of us can relate on some level to the emotional swings, nervousness, and compulsions that come with mood and anxiety disorders, it can be a lot harder for those without direct experience to relate to the symptoms of schizophrenia and dissociation. Unfortunately, we tend to to fear and avoid what we don't understand in each other, whether it's a friend or family member or just some stranger on the bus. But thankfully, part of the psychologist's job is to demystify the things that can happen in our heads, and as is often the case, understanding may be the key to compassion. Schizophrenia is a chronic condition that usually surfaces for men in their early to mid-20s and for women in their late 20s. For some, the disorder comes on gradually, but for others it can arise more suddenly, perhaps triggered by stress or trauma, although no event can actually cause the disorder. Once thought of as a single discrete condition, schizophrenia is now included in the DSM-5 as a point on a spectrum of disorders that vary in how they're expressed and how long they last, but they share similar symptoms. Schizophrenia spectrum disorders are currently thought of as characterized by disorganized thinking, emotions, and behaviors that are often incongruent with their situations, and disturbed perceptions, including delusions and hallucinations. They all involve a kind of loss of contact with reality on some level. The resulting behaviors and mental states associated with this break from reality are generally called psychotic symptoms, and they usually impair the ability to function. When someone's experiencing psychotic symptoms, their thinking and speech can become disorganized, rambling, and fragmented. This tendency to pick up one train of thought and suddenly switch to another and then another can make communication painfully difficult. People exhibiting these symptoms can also suffer a breakdown in selective attention, losing the ability to focus on one thing while filtering others out. In extreme cases, speech may become so fragmented it becomes little more than a string of meaningless words, a condition given a name that sounds like its own kind of non sequitur, word salad. Classic schizophrenia is also often marked by delusions or false beliefs not based in reality. These delusions can be rooted in ideas of grandeur, like I'm the Queen of England, or I won an Olympic gold medal for the luge. Or they can become narratives of persecution and paranoia, believing your thoughts and actions are being controlled by an outside force, or that you're being spied on or followed, or that you're on the verge of a major catastrophe. And there are some complicated variations on these delusions, like feeling that you've died or don't exist anymore, or that someone is madly in love with you, or that you're infested with parasites. Delusions of one kind or another strike as many as 4 out of 5 people with schizophrenia. While some delusions can seem fairly logical, they can also be severe and bizarre and frightening. Unfortunately, many of the most memorable examples of people suffering from severe delusions come from serial killers, and yeah, while Son of Sam did claim that he was taking orders from his neighbor's dog, that kind of stuff is in the tiny minority. Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys and Syd Barrett of Pink Floyd have both suffered psychotic symptoms. And then, of course, there's John Nash, the Nobel Prize-winning American mathematician and subject of the movie A Beautiful Mind. Through proper treatment, some people with schizophrenia have not only learned to live with their illness, but also made fantastic creative contributions to the world. Many people with schizophrenia also suffer from perceptual disturbances or sensory experiences that come without any apparent sensory stimulation, like hallucinations. This is when a person sees or hears something that isn't there, often lacking the ability to understand what is real and what isn't. Auditory hallucinations or hearing voices are the most common form, and these voices are often abusive. It's as if your inner monologue, that little conversation that you have with yourself, or the random things that float through your head, were somehow coming from outside of you. It's as if you couldn't sort out whether the voices in your mind were internal and self-generated or external and other-generated. To me, it sounds terrifying. Other common symptoms include disorganized, abnormal, or incongruent behavior and emotions. This could mean laughing when recalling a loved one's death, or crying while others are laughing, acting like a goofy child one minute, then becoming unpredictably angry or agitated the next. Movements may become inappropriate and compulsive, like continually rocking back and forth or remaining motionless for hours. Broadly, most psychotic symptoms fall into 3 general categories traditionally used by psychologists: positive, negative, and disorganized symptoms. Positive symptoms are not what they sound like. They're the type that add something to the experience of the patient, like, for example, hallucinations or inappropriate laughter or tears or delusional thoughts. Negative symptoms refer to those that subtract from normal behavior, like a reduced ability to function, neglect of personal hygiene, lack of emotion, toneless voice, expressionless face, or withdrawal from family and friends. Finally, disorganized symptoms are those jumbles of thought or speech that could include word salad and other problems with attention and organization. Symptoms like these studies are useful in diagnosing a disorder on the schizophrenia spectrum, but there's a physiological component too. Like many of the disorders we've talked about, schizophrenia has been associated with a number of brain abnormalities. Postmortem research on schizophrenia patients has found that many have extra receptors for dopamine, a neurotransmitter involved in emotion regulation and the brain's pleasure and reward centers. Some researchers think that overly responsive dopamine systems might magnify brain activity in some way, perhaps creating hallucinations and other so-called positive symptoms as the brain loses its capacity to tell the difference between internal and external stimuli. For this reason, dopamine-blocking drugs are often used as antipsychotic medications in treatment. Modern neuroimaging studies also show that some people with schizophrenia have abnormal brain activity in several different parts of the brain. One study noted that when patients were hallucinating, for example, there was unusually high activity in the thalamus, which is involved in filtering incoming sensory signals. Another study noted that patients with paranoid symptoms showed overactivity in the fear-processing amygdala. So schizophrenia seems to involve not just problems with one part of the brain, but abnormalities in several areas and their interconnections. But what might be causing these abnormalities? Earlier I mentioned how a stressful event might trigger psychotic symptoms for the first time, even though it can't actually create the disorder. Psychologists call this the diathesis stress model. This way of thinking involves a combination of biological and genetic vulnerabilities, diathesis, and environmental stressors, stress, that both contribute to the onset of schizophrenia. This model helps explain why some people with genetic vulnerability might not always develop schizophrenia, and why the rates of schizophrenia tend to be higher with some degree of poverty or socioeconomic stress. And it seems clear that there is some kind of genetic predisposition for the disorder. The 1 in 100 odds of developing schizophrenia jump to nearly 1 in 10 if you have a parent or sibling with the disorder, with about 50-50 odds if that sibling is an identical twin, even if those twins were raised apart. One recent landmark 7-year study looked at genetic samples across 35 countries, examining more than 35,000 people with schizophrenia and another 110,000 people without the disorder. The study identified more than 100 genes that may increase the risk of schizophrenia. As expected, some of these genes involve dopamine regulation, but others are related to immune system functioning. Researchers continue to tease out what is exactly going on here, but many are hopeful that these new findings will lead to better treatment. Clearly, schizophrenia is a challenging disorder to live with and one that's hard for outsiders to understand, but maybe even more rare and more elusive are the dissociative disorders. These are disorders of consciousness, called dissociative because they're marked by an interruption in conscious awareness. Patients can become separated from the thoughts or feelings that they used to have, which can result in a sudden loss of memory or even change in identity. Now, we might all experience minor dissociation at times, like maybe the sense that you're watching yourself from above, as in a movie, or like you're driving home and get so zoned out that suddenly you find yourself in front of Taco Bell thinking, like, how did I get here? Those things would generally fall into the normal range of dissociation, but most of us don't develop different personalities. Dissociative disorders come in several different forms, but the most infamous of the bunch is probably dissociative identity disorder. This has long been known as multiple personality disorder, and yes, it is a thing. It's a rare and flashy disorder in which a person exhibits 2 or more distinct and alternating identities, and the best known case was that of Shirley Mason, whose story was famously rendered in the 1973 bestseller Sybil, and later in a popular miniseries. The book was marketed as the true story of a woman who suffered great childhood trauma and ended up with 16 different personalities, ranging from Vicky, a self-assured French woman, to handyman Sid, to the religious and critical Clara. The book became a craze, and within a few years, reported cases of multiple personality skyrocketed from scarcely 100 to nearly 40,000. Many believe the book was essentially responsible for creating a new psychiatric diagnosis. It turns out, though, Sybil's story was a big fat lie. Yes, Shirley Mason was a real person, and one with a troubled, traumatic past and a number of psychological issues. As a student in New York in the 1950s, she started seeing a therapist named Connie Wilbur and taking some heavy medications. And somewhere in there, maybe because she was coaxed, or maybe because she wanted more attention, Shirley started expressing different personalities. Dr. Wilbur built a career and a book deal out of her star patient, even after Shirley confessed that her split personality was a ruse. The Sybil case is a powerful reminder that we really don't understand dissociative disorders very well, or even know if they're always real. Indeed, some people question if dissociative identity disorder is an actual disorder at all. But some studies have shown distinct body and brain states that seem to appear in different identities, things like one personality being right-handed while the other is left-handed, or different personalities having variations in their eyesight that ophthalmologists could actually detect. In these cases, dissociations of identity may be in response to stress or anxiety, a sort of extreme coping mechanism. Either way, the debate and the research continue.